Thank you so much, Ariel, and thank you to Village Preservation for inviting me to give this talk. I'm very excited to be here. This is going to be kind of a casual, loose discussion. I am, I started my life as a not started my life, but I started my interest in New York City history when I moved to New York to attend New York University. And as an NYU student, I, of course, spent a lot of time hanging around in Greenwich Village. Then I became a walking tour guide. And if you're a walking tour guide in New York City, the images of Berenice Abbott become part of the fabric of your everyday life. She took so many wonderful, award-winning landscape capturing photographs of the city that it is hard to research really any neighborhood, but especially the Village and the financial district, without coming up with her images. So I have been a fan of Berenice Abbott for a long time. This is her, just so you know who we're talking about. That on the picture that is on the left-hand side shows her in the 1920s with her camera when she was working in Paris. The portrait on the other side is from the 1980s, not long before her death. So she is one of the pioneer photographers of early, pre-World War II photography in America, in New York City. And her name maybe isn't as well known to people outside New York as it should be. Dorothea Lange, Margaret Bourke-White, other photographers perhaps have a greater following. But Berenice Abbott was really terrific. And she lived in New York essentially with a 10-year gap in Paris from 1918 until 1965. Now, the way most people know her work is through a book called Changing New York. You can see the original edition there and the reprint, the one that says the Complete WA Project on the other side. This was the work that really made her name. She got a federal grant to be part of the Federal Arts Project in the late 1930s, and she turned her camera on her adopted hometown and took stunning photographs of New York, many of which will illustrate my talk tonight. However, the impetus for this talk was actually a book that almost nobody has read and very few people have heard of. It was a book that came out in 1949 called Greenwich Village, Today and Yesterday. And as you can see from this cover, she is first billed, photographs by Berenice Abbott, and text by someone named Henry Lanier. And this book made very little impact when it was produced in 1949 and has had even less impact since. But I was very intrigued. About a year ago, I was invited to give a lecture by Village Preservation on the history of the Italians in Greenwich Village. And for those of you who came to that lecture, thank you, and thank you for coming back. And when I was putting the slides together for that show, I assumed that a number of the Berenice Abbott photos that I would be looking for would be from Changing New York, would be the photos that she had taken during the Depression. But as I started to look for a couple of specific images, they weren't coming up for me. I wasn't finding them. I knew the pictures. I could visualize them in my mind's eye, but they were not coming up for me. And that's when I realized that they came from, not from her sort of monumental work, but from this little book, Greenwich Village, Today and Yesterday. And I started to research. I read the book. It's very strange. And I started to research the history of it. And since last year was its 70th anniversary of its publication, I wrote a story for Curbed about how this book came to be, how strange it is, how it exists. And so tonight's talk, is sort of the best of Berenice Abbott, and in some ways the work. No, that's not true. But the impetus, since the impetus for this book is Greenwich Village, Today and Yesterday, we're going to sort of focus at the beginning, at least, on this book that has largely been forgotten to history. A little bit about her, and if you are like me on a small screen, all of these photos are captioned. You may have to move me around if I'm blocking any of the photos or the captions. A note about the dates. Dating Berenice Abbott photos seems to be a very difficult thing to do. If you find the same photo in 3 different museums or archives, you will find 3 different dates. On this one, you know, I said that it's got a circa date, circa 1935, circa 1936. I've seen this photo dated as late as 1938. So just so you know, if you happen to be someone who has seen this photo before or a photo like it and it has a different date, that's fine. They all have different dates. So Berenice Abbott was born in 1898 in Ohio. She had a relatively normal, though today, by today's standards, perhaps scandalous childhood. Her parents broke up when she was pretty young. She went to live with her mother. Her father sued for divorce, but was not granted it. And I'm unsure of all of the problems there. But her mother went ahead and remarried anyway. So she grew up in Ohio. She didn't really know her father until she was a teenager, when she moved back to Cleveland and met him. And it's sort of a tragic story. Not long after she rekindled her relationship with her father, he committed suicide. She never really felt like she fit in. She went to college. She didn't really feel like she was getting the whole college experience that everybody else was. And pretty much in 1918, when she was 20 years old, as soon as she could get out of Ohio, she did. And like so many young, aspiring artists of her day, she made a beeline for New York City. And the reason that this photo that I've put up is of the Provincetown Playhouse is that she was coming to New York to live with her friends. She had gone to college with a woman named Susan Jenkins. Susan Jenkins had married a man named James Light. They had moved to New York and had immediately fallen in with the crowd at the Provincetown Playhouse. And they lived next door to the theater. James Light, who directed a number of plays at the theater, eventually became the director of the sort of managing director of the Provincetown Playhouse. So I'm seeing that someone is, there's a question, should I share my screen so that the pictures are larger? I don't know if I can actually do that. On my thing, they are full screen. Let me see if I can change this at all. I don't think that I have any way to change it. You may, at your end, be able to choose, say, a full screen option, but there's nothing on my end that makes them any bigger. So, so anyway, Berenice Abbott came to New York when she was 20 to move in with the Lights. She didn't really have a trajectory in her life at this point, but she was definitely interested in the arts, and she ultimately, when she moves to New York, it's to become a sculptor. And it was quite the New York she was moving in. I mean, obviously, she was connected immediately to the Provincetown Playhouse. On her very first day in New York City, she's taken to a tavern called the Golden Swan, which everybody in the neighborhood called the Hell Hole. This is a drawing of it by John Sloan, who she probably met that first night. She probably met Eugene O'Neill, Edna St. Vincent Millay, Marcel Duchamp, Hippolyte Havel, who was a writer gadabout. So can you imagine? I mean, I have a hard time sometimes imagining showing up in New York City like she did, or like many years later Bob Dylan did in the early 60s, and you are immediately being thrown in to this world of artists and writers and thinkers and poets and actors, and it must have been a very big change. So for her to within her first week befriend these people, many of whom stayed friends with her for the rest of her life or their lives, it really set her on the right foot. She moved out from the Lights. She moved to a number of places within the village, none of which, interestingly, I could find that she ever took pictures of. She did live in this, what is called Clothesline Alley, which was off of Christopher Street. This picture is taken by a woman named Jessie Tarbox Beals, who was one of the other great early village photographers. And so she, like a lot of people in these 2 years, she's in New York from 1918 to 1920. She's a starving artist. She's trying to learn to be a sculptor. She is hanging out with a lot of free thinkers and people that are very different than what she's used to. And so she's sort of getting inculcated into the vibe of Greenwich Village. Two people that she meets early on that are going to have an influence on her are Man Ray, the photographer, and this is a portrait of Berenice Abbott taken by him in 1922, and Marcel Duchamp, who I mentioned earlier, the Dadaist artist. This chess set, which he had first designed in 1918 when he was living in Argentina, he brought the idea with him to New York, and when Berenice Abbott was a fledgling sculptor, she helped him actually physically design the pieces. You can now buy replicas of this chess set for hundreds of dollars online, and it's always credited simply to Duchamp, but Berenice Abbott had a hand in making this chess set a reality. Marcel Duchamp is also the person who changed her name, probably. She was born Berenice Abbott, Bernice, and Marcel Duchamp always pronounced it Berenice. And by the time she moves to Paris in 1920, she is pretty much taken up that spelling and pronunciation of her name. And in the 20s, she has to apply for a new passport. And when she applies for a new passport in Berlin, it is with the extra E added to her name. And so her birth certificate says Bernice, and her passport. And she, from that point, though for many years in her life, she wrote her name both ways, as did many people who knew her when she didn't have the extra E, didn't add the extra E. So what was influential about these two men is that they were in part one of the reasons why in 1920, as Prohibition was coming in, it was changing America, it was certainly changing Greenwich Village. She packed up her belongings and moved to Paris. And for the next 9 years, she lived in Paris, ostensibly early on so that she could learn to sculpt. But what happens is that she has to, like everybody else, earn a living. And so when Man Ray moves to Paris, he is in search of a darkroom assistant. And she says to him, you know, I don't really know anything about this, but if you teach me, I'd be happy to learn. And so soon she becomes an invaluable part of his portrait studio. And as you can see by these pictures, by 1925, she is taking photographs on her own. And Man Ray did not really see her as competition. He wanted her to charge as much as he charged. He wanted so as to not undercut him. She wanted her to have a career. And so you see a picture here of Jean Cocteau. She took a number of photos of him in Paris in the 20s. James Joyce, the Irish author, was also someone who sat for her on multiple occasions. And this was really the beginning of the development of her aesthetic style, that portrait photography paid the bills, but she had a very gifted eye. And so the thing about a good portrait, whether it's painted or a photograph, is that you have to evoke something in your viewer that is something of the essence of the person sitting for the portrait. And as you can see from these two, Joyce there in Contemplation, this is just around the time that he is publishing Ulysses, and it is being banned in the United States, and he has become one of the most famous writers that no one ever read in his lifetime. And Jean Cocteau was the toast of Paris. So again, in the same way that Abbott goes to New York at just the right time to meet Eugene O'Neill and Duchamp and Man Ray and Edna St. Vincent Millay, who became a lifelong friend, she arrives in Paris at the same time that everybody else is arriving in Paris. And so Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald and all of these people are there, and she finds herself in a milieu that is very productive for artists. By the time she leaves Paris, she is fully set on being a photographer. She later wrote it was one of the first times that something sort of just intuitively clicked for her, and so she moves. She towards the end of her time in Paris meets a photographer named Eugene Abbott, and he has a profound influence on her. These are two pictures that he took. He began taking pictures at the end of the 19th century, and he was one of the first photographers to sort of just go out and, as you can see in these pictures, photograph empty street scenes, buildings as they were. They are, at the same time that they are documentary evidence of what Paris and France looked like at the time, they are also emotionally evocative. He is trying to sort of meld the idea that they are both art, there's artistry and there's documentary in the same pictures. He does this as well with his pictures of people. We have I think that's a hurdy-gurdy man or something on one side, and a peddler carrying all of his wares on the other. And so these are photos that had, as I said, a profound effect on Berenice Abbott. And Abbott dies while she's still living in Paris, and she plops down a princely sum of money, I think $1,000, which was quite a bit at the time, to buy all of his photographs, all of his negatives, package them up, and send them back to the United States with her. So when she comes back to the United States in 1929, it is not so much to strike out as Berenice Abbott, photographer. It is to let the world know that Eugene Abbott is this great photographer. And for the rest of her life, she administers much of the Abbott estate. And so she gets her early gallery shows, for example, in New York, by having her work hung with his. And so the two, for people who were in the know, the two are often, still to this day, intertwined. Now, she had a photographic vocabulary entirely her own, but there's no doubt when we start looking at her pictures now that you can see the influences of Abbott in what she's doing. Now, she comes back to New York in 1929, and it's a city transformed. This is a picture she later took in Lower Manhattan. The tallest building in New York when she left had been the Woolworth Building. Now, the Chrysler Building's going up. The Empire State Building is about to be constructed. Bank of the Manhattan Company, all of these skyscrapers. We've become a skyscraper city. And her photographer's eye is immediately intrigued by this. But that being said, the photographs that she's starting to sell are much more in the Abbott sort of realm. So this is her very first photograph that she sells to a publication upon her return from New York. This is Hester Street on the Lower East Side. So it sort of combines that quality of capturing the streetscape and capturing, a sense of the people. She starts doing what is almost abstract work. This is the view looking down from the elevated railroad at Columbus Circle, 59th Street. And so she really starts to develop a visual vocabulary of her own. And sorry, my notes are, but she still has to pay the bills. So she continues to do portrait photography. Fortune magazine is founded right after the stock market crash, which I think is kind of ironic. I didn't realize that Fortune was a magazine that started publishing in 1930. This is David Sarnoff, the head of RCA and the National Broadcasting Company. This is Alelia Walker, the heir to the Madam C.J. Walker Fortune, one of the richest women in Harlem. So she is doing this magazine work for Fortune. She has a portrait studio. But as the Depression really starts to get worse and worse, portrait work is dying up, magazine work is drying up, And so she moves around. She takes some documentary photography. Here is a Hooverville in Central Park, but she's having a hard time finding work. This is a photo mosaic that was put together, and it's a little unclear if it was put together by her or on her behalf for an exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art in 1932 that was designed so that people, essentially as a contest for people to design the mural inside 30 Rockefeller Plaza. Not a contest she did not win, but an interesting juxtaposition of her appreciation of just the pure form and lines of architectural imagery. You can see, if I, here's my highlighter, that down here, that's that Columbus Circle L picture, Statue of Liberty over here. So these are photos that she had already taken. And so they were put together. As I said, she did not win that contest, but this is what she's doing in the early 30s. Some of her most famous photographs come out of this period. This is perhaps the most famous photograph that she ever took, New York at night from 1932, looking down at the well-lit city from the top of a skyscraper. Penn Station, 1934. Another view from Columbus Circle. There's the Columbus Monument in the center there from 1936. But in 1935, two things, very important things happen. One is that she meets a woman named Elizabeth McCausland, who would become her partner, her life partner, for the next 30 years until McCausland died in 1965. And they lived in the Village together for those 30 years at 50 Commerce Street. And she applied to be part of the Works Progress Administration Federal Art Project. And McCausland wrote the grant application. She was a writer, she was a journalist, and in the end, what they produced, Changing New York, was McCausland's text and Abbott's photographs that tried to capture what New York was in the late 30s, because there was this sense that if they did not take pictures of these things right away, that either they would just become so decrepit during the Depression with lack of maintenance, lack of funding, that they would disappear, or, as proved to be the case, so many of them would then, in the post-Depression, post-war era, be wiped off the map. And, as we all know, village preservation is about holding on to those things that are left. And this is exactly what Berenice Abbott was trying to do through the lens of her camera, was to figure out a way that we could hold on to some of these things. So in 1935, she was granted the money. She had darkroom assistants, she got salaried, she had all of her materials paid for to capture the face of changing New York City. This is the very first photograph she took for the project, numbers 512 to 514 Broome Street. These no longer exist, but it is this interesting, interesting juxtaposition of these much older double dormer, federal, falling apart houses. You can see that they both have fire escapes on the front. They've been converted probably into multiple residences on the top floor and shops below. And that this was a chapter in New York City history that she saw ending. New York still had a number of boarding houses at this point, and probably a lot of those were also on their way out. She continued to take some documentary evidence of what was happening in New York. This is the corner of Houston and Mercer Streets, where another Hooverville had popped up in an empty lot. This is up in the Bronx. I love this picture. On the one side, you see a bar and grill in an old building and some wagon on one, horse-drawn wagon on one side. And on the other side of your screen, you see what she labeled country store. And not only is this country store gone with its pot-bellied stove and its old clock, but Ewan Avenue, the street that all these buildings were on, is itself gone. It was probably wiped off the map sometime not that long after she took this photograph, just completely gone. So she's not just documenting sort of a lifestyle that is fading away and architecture, but entire streets that are no longer around. So we're going to skip forward. That was, she gets this job, she takes these pictures, and we're going to see quite a few of the pictures from Changing New York as I go through. It makes a big splash. She makes a name for herself. She has a lot of work. But after World War II, she's teaching at the New School. She has income. She has a stable relationship. Life's pretty good. But she asks Harper and Brothers, I was trying to remember the name, what they used to be called, Harper and Brothers Publishing, if they would be interested in publishing a book of her photographs just of Greenwich Village, to sort of mark the way that the village had not just changed in the 10 years since she had done the federal art project, but really over the whole time that she had been in the village since 1918. Now, it's a little unclear what exactly happened, but this guy, Henry Lanier, now, by the way, that's his his obituary on one side. That is not him on the other side. I could not find a single picture of Henry Lanier. That's his dad, Sidney, who was a very famous poet. He's known often as the poet of the Confederacy. He has parks and middle schools and all sorts of things in the South named after him. It's actually been a little controversial. We live in a day and age when naming things after famous Confederates is difficult. So, for example, in Houston, Texas, the Sidney Lanier Middle School had its name changed to the Bob Lanier Middle School because Bob was the mayor of Houston at one point. And so they didn't want to have to spend the money to change the name more than they had to. So Sidney became Bob. But anyway, Henry lived his entire life in the shadow of his very, very famous father. And he worked in publishing, as you can see in his obituary. He was one of the founders of Scribner's Magazine. He was friends with Mark Twain. He worked on Golden Book magazine. He published books for children. But in the 1940s, he decided that he wanted to write a book or a series of books that captured the essence of Greenwich Village. And so what is unclear is how this arranged marriage between Lanier and Abbott came about. The only thing that we know for sure is that Abbott was not happy with it. This was not her idea. But Harper and Brothers said, we're going to publish his text and your photographs. And they did, for the most part, they did not work together. And if you ever read the book, you can get it on 8 books. It's been out of print for years. Sometimes you can find an old library copy for cheap. It's a very strange book. The text and the photos have nothing to do with each other. And if we didn't have documentary evidence that showed that the two of them actually did meet and do some work together, you would have almost no sense that this book was at all a collaboration. So there it is again. The idea of the book, this is the dedication of the book. I have an old library copy. It is dedicated to that pleasant community which, like Jonah in the whale's belly, remains itself even after being swallowed. And no epigram could sum up this book and their intentions better than this one. You can tell looking at Abbott's photos, which I'm going to show you some of now, and reading Lanier's text, which I'm going to spare you from listening to, that these are two people who continue to be extremely concerned that Greenwich Village, as they knew it, was about to die. It had persisted through the Depression and Prohibition and the war. But in 1948, when they're writing 49, when they're preparing and writing this, all of New York City is kind of on the cusp of change, and new buildings are going up at a great rate. And this post-war economic boom is really taking hold. And so as you go through, you can tell that both of them are really thinking that if we don't capture this in words, in prose and photographs, Greenwich Village, the Greenwich Village that we know, is going to forever cease to exist. I just like this photo, one of the ones from the book. You'll see that I've dated them all 1948. Again, it is a little unclear. So this is, the way the book goes is that Lanier spends the first few chapters, what he says, getting the lay of the land of Greenwich Village. And what's fascinating is that he doesn't actually spend hardly any time getting the lay of the land of the center of Greenwich Village. He walks around the edges of the neighborhood. He says the only way you can understand a neighborhood is to walk its fringes. I'm like, okay. So he starts in Union Square, walks across 14th Street to West Street, walks south on West Street to Canal. We're back in an era when Soho as a concept doesn't exist. So for most New Yorkers, Greenwich Village goes down to Canal Street. He walks across Canal back to Broadway, and then walks up Broadway to Union Square. So he gets the lay of the land. So when I was writing this article for Curbed, which was part of a series that I've done on sort of retracing other people's walking tours, I did the same thing. And I thought, one thing I thought was fascinating was that these photos, all the photos that I have by Berenice Abbott of Union Square, here's this one that shows Union Square West, which is a lovely photograph. Here is the statue of Lafayette looking out at Klein's. I don't know who remembers Klein's. You see it still has the NRA, we'll put the little highlighter here, National Recovery Act logos at the top there. This is from 1935. You can see 14th Street in the background there. Get rid of the whiteboard. Here's the Civic Repertory Theater on 14th Street. These are all of the pictures that she took in and around Union Square. Henry Lanier spends a lot of time talking about Union Square in his book, and she didn't take a single new photograph. Meanwhile, a lot of these things were gone by the time, the Civic Repertory Theater was torn down by the time they were writing Greenwich Village Yesterday and Today. He gets over to West Street. Again, these are two wonderful photos by Berenice Abbott of West Street from 1936. She does not take any photographs for this book of West Street. This is Charles Lane that she took a picture of in 1938. What I like about this photograph is that I was able, during my walk, to go and reproduce it. And you can see that the street is almost 100% identical today. The buildings on either side, obviously very different, but the street itself remains. And that gets into a larger issue that, or a larger question, which is that the point of this book and the point of Berenice Abbott's photographs were to capture a city that they thought was going to disappear, a neighborhood they thought was going to disappear. And I always find it interesting what places do disappear and which do not. And sometimes the places that don't disappear are the ones that are already overlooked, for lack of a better term. So Little Charles Lane, which is one of the oldest streets in Greenwich Village, that central gutter that you see, here's my highlighter, running down here and here, that was probably, when this street was opened, an open sewer, which gives you a sense of how old it is. New York City gets running water in 1842. So streets that had central open gutters either predate plumbing entirely or are in neighborhoods where plumbing hadn't quite reached yet. So I find that interesting. Lanier laments when he gets to Weehawken Street, one of the shortest streets in the city, that there's a little wooden building with a little wooden staircase that he thinks is going to disappear. This is a photo I took of it less than 6 months ago. So not everything that we think is going to disappear ends up disappearing. Spring Street, so walking in the southern part of his route, This is another view that in many ways has not changed. Broadway and Broome, 771. I love this picture from 1937 of 2-for-1 suits and top coats at Goldberg's at 77-1 Broadway. Look, hats for $1.95, which is right there. I like that. Oops, went too far. I went too far. So Henry Lanier starts his book by having multiple chapters of him walking around this square rectangle to define Greenwich Village. He then spends almost all the rest of the book doing a sort of cockamamie history of the village from pre-Dutch colonization through the Revolutionary War. None of it's necessarily wrong, but it's based on, a lot of it is based on 19th century sources that modern historians wouldn't necessarily look at. And then there are like 3 or 4 really quick chapters at the end that are like, oh, yeah, we live in the village now today, and there's some like really great people. Part of its strangeness certainly comes from the fact that Lanier had hoped to write a second volume. And I think he was really sort of trying to do Greenwich Village Volume 1 up to 1800 or something. And then he was going to do Greenwich Village Volume 2, which never happened. He died about 10 years after this book came out and had never published another thing. I think part of it is that what happened is that he was writing this book, and they interviewed him for the New York Times. He's like, I'm working 16-hour days to get this finished. Is that he was writing this book, and he wasn't writing it with Berenice Abbott's photos at all in mind. That he was writing the book he wanted to write. She was taking the photos she wanted to take. And it was only at the 11th hour that perhaps they realized that his text and her photos had nothing to do with each other. And the last few chapters of the book are the only things that have any correlation at all. So this is a photo of Washington Square that she took in the 1930s. And one of the things I like to point out, the difference between her photos is that, you know, we've got this distant view of the arch, 1 Fifth Avenue looming up over the Row on Washington Square North. It's a very well composed, kind of static photo. You can see the Empire State Building in the center, kind of looming up there in the background. There's the Empire State Building. 10 years later, the photos that she's taking have a very different character. And when you start to look at them, these are the pictures she took of Washington Square for Greenwich Village today and yesterday. So notice that the picture of the arch, it's a much close up, and the people, none of them are looking at the camera. It's pretty much a candid shot of Greenwich Village. The same is true of the other photo. You see the statue of George Washington on the Washington Memorial Arch. You can just see a little tiny bit of it. It's filthy in this picture. These reproductions are not great, but even when you see the best possible versions of these photos, you really get a sense of how dirty New York got from the 30s into the 40s. It's really sort of interesting. So that's the Row on Washington Square. Here's another contrast. We have the Fifth Avenue bus having just come through the Washington Arch. There's 1 Fifth Avenue. She was obsessed with 1 Fifth Avenue. In the background, the photo on the other side shows a more modern bus from 1948 about to head through the arch. Notice how much darker 1 Fifth Avenue, the skyscraper, looks. Again, this is a little bit because the quality of these 1948 photographs is not as good, but it's also because the city was just getting dirtier. Now, one of the reasons, again, that they were so keen to see this happen, to capture the village as it was things like this. You can see this map of the proposed highway through Washington Square. On the left side is the present ground plan showing the fountain and the arch. And on the right side, you can see a pedestrian overpass going over the highway that would have connected Fifth Avenue and LaGuardia Place. One of the other things that changed between her pictures in the 30s and her pictures in the 40s is that in the 30s, she has more of a concentration on inanimate objects. There's the Garibaldi statue. Again, there's 1 Fifth Avenue in the background. On the other side, there's a woman on Washington Square South holding her baby by her window. So it's kind of these intimate moments that Berenice Abbott wants to capture in the 40s rather than these, I call them static. I mean, they're beautiful pictures, but they are definitely capturing a different aspect of the village. Another one, McDougal Alley. Hey, look, it's 1/5 Avenue. So again, clean, brightly lit. She spent a lot of time in the 30s working on these. Wednesday afternoons, she would often go and scout a location. She would figure out exactly when the best light was going to be, and then she would come back with herself, an assistant, her camera, and she would get absolutely the best picture. Notice that the picture of McDougal Alley on the other side of this frame from 1948, it's a close-up. She's more interested in just this single building. It looks more like a snapshot, and that's because it is a snapshot. One of the things that she had been doing in the 1940s is perfecting what she called a thumb camera, which was a large format 4-inch by 5-inch film camera that had a single focus lens, and that you could take a picture by just holding it with one hand and snapping a photo with your thumb in the other. And this is the patent for it. The patent is granted in the 1950s for this camera. So one of the differences that you see in the photographs is that she is more painstaking in the 30s for her federal artist project, and she is trying to capture a more casual snapshot in the 1940s. There's another great one from Greenwich Village yesterday and today, or today and yesterday. So I always get the name wrong. Greenwich Village today and yesterday. So artists and browsers at the Washington Square outdoor art exhibit, a tradition which continues to this day. They did have to cancel this year's, obviously, this spring, but they are prepared to reopen in the fall. I was just on their website today. So again, this is Berenice Abbott trying to think to herself as she is walking around Greenwich Village and taking these snapshots, what parts of this neighborhood are going to disappear? And it's a gamble. History is great because we can read the past and know what happened. Predicting the future is not always so easy. This is 4 to 8 Fifth Avenue, taken in the Depression for the Federal Artist Project. So, here's one where she gambled that it was going to disappear, and she was absolutely right. So it is now replaced by the behemoth that is 2 Fifth Avenue. For the a little farther up the street, in 1948, she captures someone outside the Hotel Brevoort, which was at that point really on its last legs. I once gave a walking tour to someone who lived in the Midwest, and she came to New York as a kid. She had taken a package trip sponsored by Greyhound Bus, and the only hotel that her family could afford was the only half-star hotel on the list, and it was the Brevoort, which very soon fell to the wrecking ball. And wait, did I just put the same picture of 2 Fifth Avenue on this one? Huh. Imagine that's the Brevoort. Here's the Salmagundi Club. I saw someone early on said hi, that they were a member of the Salmagundi Club. One of the ones that has not disappeared. So again, the artist can turn her lens, the photographer can turn her lens on the buildings and only guess what the future will bring. This is the Whitney Museum of American Art, which was on 8th Street in those days. Soon after this picture was taken, they decided to make the move to Madison Avenue. As you know, they were on Madison Avenue for many years in a Marcel Breuer building, and before moving back to the village. A couple of other pictures that I really like of 8th Street from this book. The one that shows the chop suey chow mein restaurant, Bamboo Forest, is really a slice of old New York that has disappeared. The butter and eggs way down. I want to know what that means, if anybody can tell me. Does that mean the price is way down? And you can see that over in the corner, There's someone just peering in the shop window. So she's just, with her snapshot camera, she is able to almost photographically eavesdrop on some of these people as they are making their way through their days in the village. This is 51 West 10th Street, known as the 10th Street Studio Building. This was very important in the life of the village. It was one of the first artist studio buildings in New York where artists would live together, work together, show their work. Again, it still existed in 1948. This, again, a snapshot. You can see someone standing outside the building. But by the 1950s, this was on the chopping block, and the wrecking ball came, and apartments were built. Patchen Place. I like this series very much. This is Patchen Place behind Jefferson Market Courthouse in 1935. And this is Patchen Place in 1948. They are practically the same photograph. So not everything. There's 35, 48. Again, not everything changes. One thing that Abbott clearly was trying to do by taking these photographs in 1948 was to capture different views of things she had already photographed. So in 1935, the 6th Avenue L and the Jefferson Market Courthouse, again, it's very clear, bright. A lot of time has been spent getting the composition of this photograph. In 1948, when she revisits the courthouse, it's from behind. So it's looking up at an angle that most people don't see or don't take the time to pause and notice. And I really think that that was one of the biggest advantages of her inventing her own snapshot camera, was that if she saw something, an angle, a person, something that caught her eye, she could, in that instant, decide to take a photograph. It wasn't come back next week with my assistant and see what happens. This is Gay Street, 14 through 16, which are at least the shells of them still there. And again, when she takes that photograph in 1948, it's the other side of the street, looking down from Christopher Street, just a very casual, almost like she's just popped in. It's the same sort of photograph that we would take today with our phones, that we would stop, we would go, oh, that looks interesting. We would very quickly take a photograph and we would move on. This is a photo of the New School, where she worked starting in the 1930s and pretty much steadily, not always employed, but she worked there through the 1960s, teaching photography. She tried to get her classes so that they would all be like on one day, so that she could just teach, and then spend the rest of her time doing her own work. There wasn't, when she was doing the Federal Artist Project, and when she was doing this book, there wasn't a lot of idea that there be a checklist that, okay, you have to go and take pictures of the Statue of Liberty and the Empire State Building and the New York Stock Exchange, though she did take pictures, I think, of all those things. These pictures, I think, were very personal to her. This was the neighborhood that she knew well. This was the neighborhood she had lived in, was living in. I think there's a good chance that the Pioneer was a place that she frequented. The interesting angle of the elevated rail on one side and the old building with the double dormers on the other clearly intrigued her. It's very well lit. But this was not a photograph of something that she thought that necessarily someone 100 years in the future would go, ah, they got a picture of the Pioneer. This was her saying, you know, I want to capture my city. And when she was in New York for those first 2 years before she moved to Paris, it's so interesting, having read her biographies, she got influenza, the Spanish flu, as we, that's a misnomer, but the influenza that came in 3 waves in 1918, 1919. She was a victim of it, and it, in some ways, incapacitated her on and off her whole life. She had trouble breathing, she would get sick easily, and she spent a lot of time in St. Vincent's Hospital recovering. And what's interesting reading her biographies is that this is sort of written off as a footnote, like there was an epidemic, but what do we care about epidemics? Well, if we were to write this book today and be researching Berenice Abbott. If anybody wants me to write a book about Berenice Abbott, if you're a publisher, just be in touch. The fact that her mindset was affected by living through the worst global pandemic in history is potentially reflected in her photographs. Certainly these photographs of Rhinelander Gardens would have been something she knew well because they were across the street from St. Vincent's. This is what's there now. That's the National Maritime Union building that now is a medical facility. St. Vincent's, of course, is no longer St. Vincent's. This is the other Rhinelander development, which she took pictures of both in 1937 and then in 1947. What's there now is PS 41. If you happen to know anyone who goes to PS 41 or teaches at PS 41, you can get inside, and inside the cafeteria of the school, they have preserved this incredible wrought iron railing work. So if you know somebody who is in the know, ask them to invite you inside. The Commerce Street twins, these are favorites of walking tour guides in New York City. It's a pleasant place to stop, and most people tell tall tales about how they came to be. But what's interesting to me is that they are directly across the street from 50 Commerce Street. She never took a picture of 50 Commerce Street, but she lived in it. She and Elizabeth McCausland lived in it for 30 years, from 1935 to 1965, because of the propriety of the time. One of them lived in a Studio 4A, and the other one lived in Studio 4B, and they pretended that they didn't live together. But one was kept as their kitchen living room, and the other was kept as their bedroom. And then evidently when they had parties, they just took over the hall space in between. So this photograph would literally have just been directly outside her front door. Right around the corner, she captured this picture of this wonderful horse-drawn dairy cart on Grove Street. Again, as I look at these pictures, I'm always thinking, you know, what's her motivation? What part of these, what did she want to capture? And I really think by a horse-drawn milk wagon was probably something that she knew was not long for this world. Meanwhile, just down the street, 45 Grove, who knows, maybe people thought that was not long for this world either, but it's still very much sitting there. As is this wonderful house at the corner of Bedford and Grove. No longer does it have fire escapes on the front. So this is a clear sign that when this picture was taken in 1936, that it had been cut up into apartments. You can see behind it, there's what used to be a workshop. I think it's now a mother-in-law apartment. And she captures that in her 1947 photo. And again, the 1947 photo is as much about the people in the crowd in front as it is about the buildings themselves. Just a couple more photos. She interestingly took 2 pictures for the Federal Artist Project of St. Luke in the Fields over on Hudson Street, 2 different angles. I don't know if that was on purpose. You can see the archive building floating back here. The old Federal Archives, again, now apartments. When she revisited the church in 1947, you can see it had lost its cross. So this is a very different photo. You can see these photos really show a sense of spaciousness. There's no cars on the street. She's pulled back so that she's really getting a wide angle view. By the time you get to the 1940s, she's doing very different. Cars, the street is parked up. She's not waiting for that perfect moment. I know I keep saying the same thing over and over. She's trying to capture in the 40s a sense of what makes the village the village. Perhaps my absolute favorite picture from the entire book is manuscripts typed, quick service, 60 cents for 1,000 words, carbon free, special rate on novels and plays. So there's a sense that, you know, Greenwich Village in 1948, it might be on the cusp of something, but there's still novelists and playwrights who are hanging around and paying cheap rents, and it might not be the Eugene O'Neills and the Edna St. Vincent Malays anymore, but there are people there who still have the who still carry the spirit forward of the village that she had moved to 40 years earlier. I love Dinty more antiquated antiques as opposed to new antiques. Two views of Christopher Street from 1936 and from 1948 with that wonderful clock. Down on Bleecker Street, if you attended my Italians in Greenwich Village lecture last year, I talked about Maury's, which was one of the great Italian restaurants in the village. And those columns on the ground floor were designed by a tenant who lived above the place. His name was Ray Hood. He went on to be the lead architect of Rockefeller Center. Two side-by-side pictures from the Federal Artist Project of a cheese shop and a bread store. And what I love about that bread store is that it is one of the few photos that she retook almost exactly from the same place and same angle in 1947. But in the 30s, she has someone looking out the window at her while she takes a picture of the front of the shop. And in the 1940s, she manages to capture one of the bakers coming up from the basement with a basket full of bread. And it's just interesting. I think there's a dynamism to the photo from the 40s. I like the one from the 30s too. I love the 5-cent bread and the person wondering. Evidently, people wondered a lot what she was doing, because she would go and she would set up her camera and she would take these pictures, and people would come out going, what are you doing? Why are you taking a picture of my store? The last set of pictures from the book are of sort of village regulars. The bar at Joe's closed not long after this was taken. She just gets a picture of some regulars at the bar. Calypso was a restaurant in the village, at which this is the nightly entertainment. These are some of her friends. Romany Marie had been a fixture in the village since the 19-teens. She had a sort of rotating series of restaurants, and she was a real character. Edward Hopper lived on Washington Square North on the Row and had his studio there. Later, when the building got central heating, he evidently sent that stove up to her. She'd moved to Maine and needed the heat. That's Isamu Noguchi working in his studio. He had been an early proponent of her work and actually did a sculpture of her. And John Sloan, whose picture we saw at the very beginning of the Golden Swan, the Hellhole, that's a picture of him in his studio. So in a way, these are people that she had known in the village for 30 years, and she was revisiting them here, some of whom were having their swan songs. I mean, Hopper and Sloan did not live for a huge amount of time beyond this. And so just to finish up, they published this book in 1949. It dropped like a lead weight. There was a small gallery show of the photographs. The book was, it sold. It was not a complete failure, but the reviews were not kind. A number of the reviews say things along the lines of, "This is not Abbott's best work. If you remember what she did in the 30s, go look at that." A lot of the reviews were as perplexed as I was when I read the book about what Lanier was trying to do with his text. And so the whole book, it was an odd arranged marriage, as I called it before, from the beginning, and it remained that. And what Berenice Abbott became the pioneer of in the 50s after this was she changed her focus almost entirely and became one of the premier scientific photographers in the world. This is just a couple of examples of her work. We have the bouncing ball in diminishing arcs. We have the behavior of waves. When Elizabeth McCausland died in 1965, Berenice Abbott moved to a little town in Maine where she lived until she died in 1991. She took a series of photographs in the 60s of Maine life. Here's one called Balancing Act. And they were published in a book in 1968 or 69, and that was her real last publication. Throughout her life, she continued to promote the work of Eugene Auger, which meant that her name and his name stayed very connected. And it's taken a while since her death for her own light to shine. That's all the slides I have. You've been very patient with me. And if there are a couple of questions that people want to ask, I can look in the Q&A here myself and see if there are. Okay, so I'm going to answer these first two questions. The third question, to take any pictures on our own block, Commerce, and I did show that one picture. Someone's asking, one of the first women photographers, how did she handle working in public? Were men the usual photographers? Certainly men were the usual photographers. And it is unclear to me, reading about this, whether or not she got so many stares and things because she was a woman, or because, you know, her early work are not snapshots. I mean, she's scoping out. Sort of imagine if someone decided your house or your apartment building was very interesting, and they spent a long time across the street staring at it. I do this actually all the time. And then came back the next week with a giant giant camera, and started taking pictures, you'd probably come out. And so there's a very famous picture that I don't have in this slideshow of a store on the Bowery, and there's a man walking towards the camera in it. And that's exactly what it was someone saying, you know, what the heck are you doing? Why are you here? Someone also asks if they were intentionally blurry. There's three things going on there. Some were blurry because of the limitations of the medium. Some are blurry because there are not good negatives left. And so what we're getting are reproductions of reproductions. And in part, some of the ones that I took from my copy of Greenwich Village today and yesterday, it's just, in 1949, I have a first edition. When it was printed, it's just not very good. The printing is not very good. And if we had access to the original pictures, some of which are available, MoMA owns some of them, they do get clearer. So let's see what else. Do more thumb camera snapshots exist in any collections? So definitely in Maine, if you go to Bates, so the question is, do the thumb camera snapshot photos exist in any collections? So if you go to Bates, Bates has a lot of her Maine photos, some of which are snapshots, thumb camera, and some of which are taken with more professional equipment. MoMA has a significant amount of her work, including some of the pictures from the 40s, but not all of them. There's an archive in Australia that has a tremendous amount of her work. I do not know how it ended up in Australia, but a lot of her work ended up there. A couple of people have asked about the science photos. Whether she was doing this just in her own time. She was mostly doing this on commission. A number of her works, a number of her pictures were commissioned for science books, science textbooks, in order to illustrate scientific properties. And so once she had sort of worked out the technicalities of the camera work, she sort of became this go-to person. She has this patent on the thumb camera. She held other patents as well, which allowed her to take these pictures. Are the Aget pictures at the New York Public Library? Someone asked. I don't know the answer to that question. A lot of them are available online. I don't know who owns the negatives. She owned most of the negatives when she owned all the negatives when she moved to New York. She went into an arrangement with someone whose name I'm not remembering, who bought a half share, but she did continue to own the rights for a long time, and what the disposition of the Eugene Aget rights was after her death. Someone asked if she made money off her patents, which is a great question, and I don't know the answer. I'd really like to know. Someone asked if the highway through Washington Square was a Robert Moses proposal. Certainly it was Robert Moses era. Whether it was originally his idea or not, I can't tell you, but he was definitely a vocal proponent of it. As you know, Shirley Hayes, or you might know, Shirley Hayes and Jane Jacobs were very instrumental in not only making sure that that highway did not go through that, but that eventually traffic was kicked out of the park. Jane Jacobs and Berenice Abbott were good friends. And so the Jacobses would go up to Maine in the summer and visit Berenice Abbott in Maine. I'm maybe going to answer one more question. Someone's asking whether Little Charles Street and Charles Street are the same thing. That is a good question, to which I'm not off the top of my head, without Googling it, being able to answer. Let's see. How did her working relationship with Henry Russell Hitchcock get started? That I'm off the top of my head not remembering either. So she very much was always at the right place at the right time, which I find fascinating. Again, I could move someplace and I would not, on my first night, meet Eugene O'Neill, and I would not become friends with Marcel Duchamp, and I would not. When she lived in Paris, she had no money, even after she started working, but she was constantly meeting wealthy people who would let her sail back and forth from New York to Paris, pretty much on a whim. And when Henry Russell Hitchcock came into her life, I can't remember. I'm sure it is addressed in one of her biographies. There are a couple of good books of hers out there. One that I recommend, which is not a biography, that is just a fascinating document, came out in 2004. Her book was called Changing New York. And in 2004, a book came out called New York Changing, which is side-by-side photographs of Berenice Abbott's federal art project photos and modern photography of the exact same spot, showing how the city has changed. And two things are fascinating about it. One is, now looking at this book 16 years later, there are a number of things that were photographed just in 2004 that aren't necessarily there. But the other thing is that it really underlines what my thesis, which is that Abbott was taking pictures of things in New York that interested her, that she had a personal connection to, that somehow she wanted to capture for her own personal reasons. And when you look at the side-by-side photos of something you don't know from the 30s that has been replaced by something you don't know today, to me, it really just shows that no matter how well we know New York, there are corners of it that escape our vantage if we don't have someone there to take a picture, because someone where it does capture their imagination. So I'm very thankful to all the photographers of this era, but especially thankful to Abbott that she loved the village, that she wanted to take these photographs. So I think I'm going to leave you with that. I do appreciate that such a very large crowd came for this talk, and who knows what the next one will be.
Well, we're looking forward to it no matter what.
Thank you, Ariel.
Thank you so much, James, and thanks to everyone for being here with us. We really appreciate it, and we hope to see you soon, whether it's virtually or in person. So take good care of you and yours.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye, everyone.